was that the Iraqi forces just showed no will to fight.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense has some tough talk for Iraq. Ashton Carter says the Iraqi military lacks the will to fight and that it won't engage ISIS militants, even with superior forces. The comments follow the latest setback for the government in the fight for the city of Ramadi. ISIS has been making steady territorial gains in Iraq. For more now on this, we're joined by Kamran Bokhari. He's an expert on geopolitics in the Middle East and South Asia. Kamran, what do you make of the U.S. Secretary of Defense's statements today that the army essentially lacks the will to fight in Iraq against ISIS?
Well, Asha, there is a morale problem, and there's a reason behind that, is that you have a Shiite-dominated Iraqi army that's trying to fight ISIS or Daesh in Sunni territory, and there's the sectarian clash there. So if you are a Shiite soldier or commander with a number of troops, your local population is very hostile to you. And therefore, I think, yes, there is a morale problem, but I think that there's more to it than what the Secretary spoke about.
So when you say there's more to it, I mean, these are complex circumstances we're talking about, but then if you can break it down, what else is there when people are looking at it face value and saying, well, maybe that's right, maybe that is the case?
That is the case, plus much, much more.
Right, so what is the much more?
The much more is that, look, we've seen Iraqi army forces fight in Salahuddin, which is north of Baghdad. Anbar, and where Ramadi is located, is west of Baghdad. So you've got multiple fronts. There's also a disconnect between the Kurds in the north, who have an autonomous region within the Iraqi Republic, and the Shiite-dominated government in Baghdad. They're also not on the same page. There is a lack of Sunni support for the government's efforts. There is the U.S. and Iranian disconnect over what should happen in Iraq. So there are lots of factors that are shaping the ability of Iraqi security forces to go on the offensive.
With all these factions, though, then how do you fight collectively against ISIS, who clearly seems to be a cohesive unit at this point, from what we've seen?
I recently interviewed a former vice president of Iraq in Doha. This was about a couple of months ago. He's living in exile in the Qatari capital. And he said, look, when I go to the youth of the Sunnis in my area in Iraq, and I say, you got to leave ISIS, you got to join the mainstream. And their response is, Mr. Vice President, you cannot protect your own self. How should we be able to believe you? And therefore, there is a lack of trust in a Sunni leadership. There is no cohesive Sunni leadership. So you got to work on the political front. Once you have the political principles and the stakeholders on the same page, then the battle will follow from there.
Whose job is that?
That is the job of everybody to a certain degree. The United States has a role, Iran has a role, Turkey has a role, Saudi Arabia has a role, the Kurds, the Sunnis, the Shiites inside Iraq have a role. So this is a multiplayer environment, and all those players have to come together in the form of a machine to really roll back ISIS.
And, you know, you mentioned the U.S., the Iraqi Parliamentary Defense and Security Committee coming out in response to Carter's comments and says, we're not getting enough from the U.S. to support the Iraqi troops here. Do you think that's a fair assessment? There
is a certain level of truth to that, but of course there's also that every faction, every individual commenting on this, minus us analysts, have an axe to grind. And so there's politics behind it. But the bottom line is yes, there should be more U.S. support. There are just too many players. When you have too many people inside a kitchen, you can only expect what they can cook. And therefore here, they're not cooking that, or building that silver bullet that can go hit ISIS.
This is a broad paintbrush kind of question to you, but we are seeing the continuous momentum of ISIS, both in Iraq and Syria. Many people wondering, what can you do to stop this? How do we end this, push forward? What would you say for with all these coalitions and all these fighters trying to keep them at bay? What do you do? How do you do it?
Well, that is the problem. There's just too many people, too many actors, too many factions trying to intervene. Now, and it goes back to what I said earlier. You have to have the political framework in place, both in Iraq and Syria. Iraq, it's a bit easier. Syria, it's really difficult because the regime itself is under question, the Assad regime. As for ISIS, I really would urge caution in terms of saying that they're on the march. This is a back and forth. We've seen them take Ramadi, lose Ramadi over the past 1 year twice.
Okay.
So we need to be careful not to exaggerate ISIS's gains. Definitely, it's not in decline, but it's not as if it's going to take over all of a sudden either.
Okay, so basically, are you saying that this is, a back and forth, that this could potentially come out of ISIS's hands at some point if the fight against them, is strong?
Absolutely. We need to know that ISIS is not some invincible force that we can't take over. ISIS is exploiting weaknesses, the geopolitical realities, the sectarianism. Otherwise, ISIS is not that big of a deal if we can take care of the geosectarianism and the geopolitics of this. So, and all battles are driven by geopolitical realities. And if we can get the geopolitics right, then this should not be a problem. I'm not trying to underestimate it, but I'm also trying to, urge caution that we not think of this as some big monster that's about to take over.
Very interesting. Appreciate your insight. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Kamran Bokhari is an expert on geopolitics in the Middle East and South Asia.